Hello everyone. We're back online at DevGAMM, and for the next hour, we're going to have a lovely fireside chat with Thomas Beekers, lead narrative designer in inXile Entertainment. Hello, Thomas. How are you?
Hello, everyone. I am well.
Great. So, tell us a bit about yourself and what you've been doing in game dev so far.
Sure. Hello, everyone again. I am one of those cases that kind of stumbled into game dev, a person who did not necessarily know I had this career path early in my life. In actuality, in university, I studied history and then Russian studies, believe it or not. Although please do not ask me to speak Russian. My Russian is extremely rusty. As I was wrapping it up, I was doing some work for inXile and its founder, Brian Fargo, who's been in the game industry since before most of us were born, to be quite honest. Like his first games are from 1986 or 1987. And I emailed him and simply asked, we're working together a bit. Can we turn that into a job? And he was looking for someone with my skill set, and he was like, yep, let's do it. So I started at inXile 8.5 years ago, I think now. As a line producer was my title when I started, which is kind of our most entry-level producer that kind of does more or less whatever is needed. Worked my way up, did a little bit of writing and design on a lot of our titles, Wasteland 2, Torment Tides of Numenera. But when we went into Wasteland 3, which is our most recent released game, and production started, I don't know, like 4 years ago. When we moved into that, I was a creative producer on the title, which meant I did a lot of actual creative design work as well as the creative production work. And that eventually turned into becoming the senior narrative designer and the team lead at the end of the project, when we had a team of about 5 or 6 writers, I think. So I was leading that team as we were doing the final bits, which can be quite hard because that's when you're doing localization and VO and the last bits of writing all at the same time. So it was a fun process though. And then on top of that, I also do a little bit of narrative consulting for kind of different little projects that could use my help. So I worked on a couple of cool indie titles, Intercosmos on VR, Metamorphosis, which is a great little Kafka game. And I'm working on a few other projects like that right now.
Sounds fascinating. And you're like a long-term veteran and still alive. Hey, looking great.
Still alive, still at the same company too. Although I will say, for everyone's context, I usually actually work California hours, and it is currently, I think, 4 a.m. in California. So if I am constantly sipping my coffee and seem a little bit insane, then just blame it on my my very early day.
How long are you going like this with Californian hours?
Pretty much my entire career so far.
Oh, so, wow.
Yes.
My God. All right. I mean, I'm fascinated by the Russian studies and also Californian time. It's a lot of things to talk, but we're here to talk mostly about narrative. How do you think, what makes good game narrative versus other mediums?
Yeah, that's always a fun question, isn't it? Because there is always a tendency to look cross media and to be like, this is what the latest movies are doing, or I read this book about writing, can we use these lessons? But it never really translates like that. Like, I am very surprised when things translate 100%, because I mean, the very basic of it, the simplest way to put it, which is very kind of banal but true, is you play game narratives, right? You don't watch them. So the way people engage with game narrative is just inherently different from movies. And I think what that means, and what a lot of narrative designers and writers can be a little stubborn about accepting, is that your actual story, like your storyline throughout the game, is probably like third on your list of most important things for the game story. After, like, what are your characters? That is probably number one, because people attach to characters more in video games than anything else. And what are your like core beats? Like, what are the moments, the twists, what have you, that you want to stick with the player? Because like, if you ask someone to retell you the story of Bioshock, they cannot. If you ask them, hey, do you remember the line, would you kindly from Bioshock? It will be like, oh, yes, I remember that. So that's like a completely different focus for writing compared to like movies.
Do you think games take a lot from movies these days, or is it vice versa?
That is a good question. I think it depends. Is kind of a tough answer, right? I do think there's always been, like, we're maturing, right, as an industry. I think in the olden days, like the 90s or 10 years ago or whenever, we were still looking at movies a lot. But by this point, the industry is bigger than movies, and they should be looking at us more than vice versa. So I think we're starting to shed those lessons. But on the other hand, if you look at it from like a human history perspective, we've been writing books and then making stories, making plays a lot longer than games, right? So there is still a lot to learn there that I don't want to ignore either. But you do have to realize it's a new medium and it is different.
Got it. Sounds good. All right. So working on game with IPs, is it harder? Is it easier? How is it different?
Is it harder or easier? I'd probably pick harder from those two, but I think it's mostly different. I would say I have worked on some well-established and long existing IPs. Personally, I've never worked on the situation where you're licensing an IP from a third. Oh no, that's actually not quite true. I did. So if you're licensing an IP in particular, different rules apply. Like, it can be easier in the sense of most of the questions that you still need to ask at the start of pre-production are obviously answered. The rules are set, the lines are set. You know what you're making and you know what you're not making, but that can also be constraining. So if your vision for the game doesn't mesh well with what the IP actually is, then it's harder. That's the best way to put it. But that obviously shouldn't be the case. Like, if you're making a game and an IP, your vision should mesh with what the IP is, if that makes sense.
Yeah. How easy it is to actually fit the narrative into the guidelines of an IP in general?
In general, yeah, it's a tough question because I think it varies so much, right? Like, I do know I've never worked on, what you would call traditional big IPs like Star Wars or the like. Obviously, when you do, they're gonna have a lot of opinions, right? You're gonna get books and books and books of stuff with instructions and tests, and often it has to go back to them for read-throughs and testing. I don't have enough personal experience with it other than to say it's going to add a lot to your process. But again, to stress, it can also be hard to figure out some of these questions from scratch. And I think a lot of game projects that do have completely free IPs don't necessarily spend the time that you need to do that, because narrative pre-production for a new IP title needs to be like almost like a multi-year process, because you can't just have those answers that an IP made in, like, how old is Star Wars? Star Wars is like 40, 50 years old. Like, Star Wars has made all those answers in 40 or 50 years, right? Like, you can't just have those answers when you start a new IP, a new game.
True. And how is working on sequels compared to creating a game from scratch?
I would say kind of similar, in the sense of you already know what you are and are not. And that can be both a downside and an upside, right? Because the big upside is, and it is a big upside, is we know the tone. We know what works and doesn't work. Like, people may have tried things and see that it doesn't work. On the other hand, it can feel constraining because you're like, but I want to go in this direction. And then people are like, well, then go make your own game because we're making a sequel to this game. And that's not what this setting is, or what this has as an established tone.
Do you guys do some sort of feedback hunting, going on forums after the game being released and like, okay, we grabbed these ideas for the sequel, or we understood that people are disappointed with this stuff, especially in the narrative. So how does this legacy work in terms of narrative?
That is a good question. The answer is yes. I mean, the studio I work at is quite data-driven, not as in the data makes the decisions for us, because I think that's the danger with data-driven design, right? Is when you're just like, oh, the data says this, so we're going to do it. It's more like, we want all this data for context, and then we can make better decisions. And for that, we do go all over forums and social media, but also do some like direct playtesting and feedback forums. A lot of our games have been in early access, which allowed us to then literally said we kickstarted a lot of games as well back when. We're not going to go back to that anytime soon, but that did allow us to have direct lines with our backers and be like, what do you like, what do you not like? And that did include narrative. Narrative is hard to adjust at that stage usually when you're in early access, but you do learn things that you then take forward into your next projects.
Can you remember the most pleasant comment you were hyped about the narrative, and like the ugliest one?
The most pleasant what?
The most pleasant comment you've seen from the players after the game being released.
That is a good question. What I like is we work on, our narratives are very large in the sense of most of our game scripts are 500,000 words or more. Like some of them have been well over 1 million, which means we have a lot of individual narrative designers that put in a lot of like little details. And my favorite is when people notice those little details. One thing I put into the game, of course, going back to my Russian studies, is there are Soviet robots in one part of Wasteland 3. They speak Russian, which obviously we work with localization to do. Their localization is in Russian in every language, so in English, French, and German, except in Russian, where it switches back to English. And I thought that was a fun little like text joke to pull that I was glad people actually noticed.
Great. And I hope we're going to return to the question of playtesting narrative like in 20 minutes or so. We're lucky enough. So moving forward, what are your creative methods as a narrative designer?
Sit here and think a lot. I mean, I will say, so I have been a team lead now for a while, and that has taught me one thing, which is that everyone has very different methods, and they're all fine. Like whatever works for the individual is good. We are a very iterative studio ourselves in inXile, which is a good thing for narrative, and that means what we don't do is try to sit around and think of the perfect ideas and think of the best way to absolutely ship things. We just need to have a start, and then we start iterating on it. So that is the best description of our creative method. It's just like get stuff on the page and then iterate from there. When it comes to like where do we actually get the ideas from though, the answer is kind of everywhere. I know I said we're separate from movies and books earlier, but that's exactly the point where those things can be relevant, right? Like I do love watching movies, TV, reading books. I'm reading Metropole right now, great book. I'm like, whenever I'm reading something, I'm always looking at what the writer is doing, how they're doing it, and for interesting little ideas. Oh, and personally, I love real life history as well for inspiration, because there's a lot of weird stuff in real life history, like where you go, oh, I didn't know people did that at that time. And then if you call that back in, it feels more real because it did actually happen, but it is also a nice little detail to put in your game. Wasteland in particular is a retro 1980s setting, so we can pull in a lot of like 80s ideas in for extra flavor and entertainment.
Great. And as a narrative designer yourself, and also being the lead of the team, do you get to write things, or do you just get the creative control and people just spring?
That's what people often say about becoming a lead in this industry, right? The first thing you have to be okay with is the fact that you're not going to do anything anymore.
And delegated stuff.
Yes. Right now, especially, I am not doing a lot of writing myself. The way it tends to work with us is my team was smaller at the very start of the project. It was just me and 2 other people. At that point, I was still spending a good 60-70% of my time actually doing my own work. Now I lead, I think, 7 people, and I'm just leading. Like I'm just directing them, coordinating them, reviewing them, all that kind of stuff. And I personally, I'm quite okay with that because it's kind of a skill set thing, and what makes a good, because what makes a good lead and what makes a like great, let's say, senior writer, like great principal writer, are pretty different skill sets. And I think you kind of have to realize that when you switch those jobs, your focus has to be a little different, because I'm not Personally, don't necessarily tell my team I said this, but personally, I don't think I'm the best writer on the team. I mean, there's several there who are better writers than I am, but I know that. So, but they get their guidance and feedback from me, and it works extremely well.
Do you think the writing team in games is very much different from what they have for TV shows or movies or this kind of stuff?
The writing teams?
Yes.
Yes, a little bit dependent, I think, on the studio again. Obviously, I never worked in movies and TV shows, but I think I know from hearing and seeing kind of how it works. And I think the fact is, I know we may talk more on this later, but I do think a narrative designer's job is quite different from a TV writer's job. Like, you don't hand off a script and then you're done, at least not at our studio. Where an iterative and communicative process, our narrative team is integrated with the rest of the team. Like I am talking to everyone on every department, like engineering, UI, design, doesn't matter, every day, because every bit of the game, we're a very narrative driven studio, and every bit of the game has to support the narrative and has to be keyed off what the narrative, not so much what the narrative needs, because now I'm making it sound like, like we're running the whole show. But narrative is the starting point with our studio, and helps set and inform the tone of pretty much everything that we do in our games.
All right. So what's the right mindset for a narrative designer in RPGs? Or something like, I wish I knew that before coming to the industry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, kind of related to what I just said, right? Depending on how fresh you're coming in, I think the mistake that people make, although I'm sure it's still true for some studios, but I think what people get wrong is that as a writer, you just sit there and write. That's not a game writer. If you want to do that, write a book, right? It's great. Go write a book. But video games, and especially for me, at least, the definition of narrative designer versus writer is you're designing. So you have to be able to think as a designer, which means you have to think a lot about the player experience, and a lot about how does the player experience this? How does the player see what I want them to see? And is it interesting for the player, rather than just be focused on your own story and stuff? It's really about being a good narrative designer. It's about optimizing how players experience your story, not so much writing the greatest story, because writing the greatest story doesn't matter if you don't know how to deliver it in a video game form.
How would you rate the importance of soft skills comparing to hard skills for aspiring narrative designer?
Well, personally, quite high. But again, I want to preface all this by saying it changes very much per studio, right? Because especially in AAA studios, I know there can be more of a flow where you're just in your booth doing your thing. The producers will take care of interdepartmental communication, and it doesn't matter that much. But when you go to smaller studios, and inXile is getting larger now, but we started pretty small. And when you start small, usually that means you have to be able to wear multiple hats. So obviously, any skill that you have for in-engine or tools understanding, or like I did a lot of localization work or a lot of VO pipeline work, because it's just kind of expected, is important. But soft skills are a part of that too, because without soft skills, like, how does narrative's point get to the rest of the team, right? Like a big part of narrative designers' work, at least in the way that we work, is making sure that everyone knows but also is buying into the narrative vision. Obviously, if you can't make them believe that the narrative vision is the right one, they're never going to execute on it the way that you need them to, because art's vision might be wildly different from narrative's vision. And some of that is okay, because some of that is the creative process, right? It's a little bit of give and take. But if they don't get the narrative vision at all, or simply don't believe that you have the right narrative vision, you're just going to have a disaster. Like, everything's going to be completely out of sync.
And if we're talking about RPGs, people usually know them because of the branching dialogues. So how do you guys manage this mass of dialogues and branching and options and this stuff?
By going insane? It's pretty crazy, yes. We actually use a custom tool set ourselves in inXile, not one that we made, but one that Obsidian made. I think they've done some talks about it if anyone's curious. It is however, not a publicly available tool set. It is fantastic though, which is a little annoying for me to say. It's to be like, yeah, it's a fantastic tool set and nobody can use it except for us few studios. But it is really good. And my answer there is that you need a good tool set. Like some of our very first titles, the text just existed in CSVs essentially in the game, like Excel sheets. That is insane, crazy talk. Don't do that for narrative games. You need something that's your equivalent of like Twine, Artisy Draft. There's a lot of publicly available good tools now. Something that controls the flow of the narrative. But that's just the tool side. On the kind of human side, for lack of a better term, lots of work is just the answer. Like we start writing very early in the process. And like I said, we're iterative. So what we tend to do is get everything in some state, everything in and working. And then we iterate and iterate and iterate and iterate. But every dialogue in Wasteland 3 has been looked at least like 4 or 5 times in a full review format, plus like tweaked and fixed up at other parts of the pipeline.
Okay, is there I wouldn't say easy, but effective way to keep the rest of the team up to date with which direction the narrative is heading to? Like what is the current, let's say, the mainstream of the story, what's the game is about? Because while you're iterating and there's like lots of branching stuff at the same time, and people don't like to read GDD and like all the updates, what's the best way to keep them updated anyway?
Yeah, I mean, we have them, the GDDs, and they're like 180 pages plus per zone kind of deal. I don't ask anyone to read those other than level designers, perhaps. There is no easy answers. The first, obviously, things that do help is excellent and up-to-date documentation, which takes work, and that's what it is, right? You have to be willing and able to put in that work. So there are core pieces of documentation that we do for each project, which includes the story, which we have to keep live. If we don't keep it live, people are going to get out of sync. The second part is talking. I know, speaking of soft skills, like you have to be willing and able to present updates to team members. There are times where I have to communicate smaller changes and I have to remember who it's relevant for and make sure that they all know. And there are times where we have to get like the whole team together and be like, it's been a while, story's had a lot of iteration, let's sit down and talk through the story as it is outlined right now.
Great. And in terms of RPGs, do you think there's something like really different in the way you write a story for RPG comparing to other genres?
Yes, namely it's harder. I mean, RPGs, again, the definitions are broad, right? So it depends on how branching your RPG is and what type it is. But I know that in a lot of other genres, obviously the story and the narrative work can come later. Like I know shooters are often made in a way where they have all the levels and then they just bring in a writer and they're like, hey, write us a campaign, and we kind of slap in some cutscenes. And that doesn't sound like a good process to me, but it works. But for RPGs, that's obviously impossible. You kind of have to start. You have to start with narrative, and narrative has to be integrated throughout. That's kind of the main pipeline difference that you have to realize. But then on the narrative practical side, I think what you have to think about more than a lot of other genres, though not necessarily each one, this is true for like open world games as well, is that the player becomes, like player action and agency are way more unpredictable in RPGs and open world games. So you can't be like, and then the player does this, or, and then the main character feels this, because all of those things are player decisions. Where the player is coming from, how their character feels about something, how they act next, should always be a list of options and never, and then this, and then this, and then this. That's more, again, that's a totally valid way to do things in certain genres. Like I'm sure The Last of Us, for instance, is written like that, where they go like, you know, then the main character feels this, that's fine. But we can't do that in RPGs, because if I'm writing a character that's player defined, if I'm writing Commander Shepard or whatever, I can't say, and then Commander Shepard gets mad. That has to be a player choice, where there is a list of him either getting mad or being okay with the situation.
How easy it is for you personally to set up a character in an RPG? I mean, if you had a choice of having an absolutely plain character and giving the player the abilities to role play like every single archetype, or on the contrary, being quite strict. Let's take like Geralt from Witcher, that's already a personality, and the options are somewhat limited in terms of what he can and can't say. So, like, what's your personal favorite?
I mean, personally, I tend to play games more that are more open. Like my favorite RPGs are more like the old Fallouts or kind of those type of RPGs. However, I also love The Witcher, right? I absolutely adored The Witcher 3. So I think the more important thing, rather than saying, like, I'm not going to pretend one is better than the other. And in fact, we've done different things in our games. In Torment, you are more of a predefined character. In Wasteland 2 and 3, you're not even one character. You're like a squad of rangers, which is extremely difficult to write, obviously, because you're talking for a whole squad of people instead of as one person. So we have done different things, and I don't actually think either way is better. I think where problems happen is when you don't know where you're at. Like there's a skill in video games from, let's say, Fallout 3's protagonist, which is like completely player defined. They said a little bit of background, but not much, right? But even Fallout 4 is already more defined than Fallout 3. And then obviously on the other end of the scale is more the Geralt level of thing. So you have to pick like early in the game. And again, this is where pre-production is very important. Early in the production process, you have to know where you're at in that sliver. If you don't, you're going to have problems because the way your character is written is going to be inconsistent. The amount of voice you give your character is going to be inconsistent. So you have to be able to tell all your team, both narrative and the rest of the team, this is where we fit on this skill. Because if that's unclear, then yeah, they don't know how to write this character.
Got it. All right, so we all know that being a narrative designer is quite an unpredictable job, and a lot of changes need to happen. So I'm wondering whether you figure out the pattern to react to changes that works for you personally. For example, did you have any cases when out of the blue you had to massively change things in production or narrative? For example, the game is out and people are saying like text is boring, or they want another narrative feature or something like that.
I don't think that's ever happened post-release with us. But again, we're a very iterative studio. And my answer to the question is I don't think there is a good answer for how to solve it. There's no like secret sauce. It just takes time and work. So personally, what I have found is the best way to approach it is to know beforehand that takes time and work. Like you start the game, you have your story, you have your areas, you know your large quests. Don't lie to yourself and go like, okay, now this is set and we're going to ship with this. You will never ship with that. That's at least not in RPGs. Like something is going to change beforehand, right? And you have to pre-plan what will happen, in particular when things get cut or added, because that happens all the time, right? Like as we're playing the game, as we're testing it out, we can realize we have too few factions, or faction interactions aren't like integrated into the story enough. And in those cases, when they come back to me as, you know, in this case, the narrative lead, I have to already be able to say, that is something I thought about, and I know the spots where we can fit it in. And the same for when cuts happen, because cuts are kind of the most common thing to happen from pre-production to, and that's a good thing, to be clear, because we write so much game in pre-production. If we ever shipped one of our RPGs fully, it'd be, I don't know, 200-300 hours. I don't think anyone would ever finish it. So cuts usually make the game better, is the thing about them. We never like them in the spot, but they make the game better. But you have to already have a plan for like, well, what happens if we cut this quest or this area? Like all the stuff that's integrated to it, what do we do with it? The more you know those answers beforehand, the smoother that process is going to go.
How do you understand which part to cut off?
That is really a negotiation, right? Because a lot of that decision comes down to scope, honestly. Like that is just I think a video game production reality. But it is also a narrative decision in the sense of like, we do know which parts are hardest to move, which parts absolutely cannot move without breaking the narrative flow. And we tend to communicate that to the rest of the team. So even when we outline our story or outline our quest, we tend to block out a little bit that says, well, these are the things that have to happen. Like you can cut around all the rest, you can change all the rest. Because I keep saying cuts, but a lot of this is iteration too. Like a lot of it is a level designer looking at a narrative idea and going like, well, that's great, but I'm going to throw it out and do it completely differently, because genuinely they often know better how to make that narrative work better for the player, right? But I do have to communicate to them, well, what are the parts that you cannot do that with?
Mm-hmm. Right. And you're saying a lot that you guys are iterating stuff. So, and have this channel of information with the playtesters from the early access. So how's this playtesting narrative been working for you? Do you have some sort of KPIs, like what's the method? How early do you start playtesting?
I don't know if we have very specific methodologies that I can share or be specific on, other than you can't do without. Like I know that there are projects where the narrative doesn't really get play tested as such. That doesn't work for us because we're an RPG, right? So the way it tends to work is narrative goes through the exact same process as everything else goes, and every level and bit of content in any of our games that we shipped has always been played and played and played and played and played and played, both in the studio and sometimes from outside groups, which can obviously just be QA, but it can be testing as well. In my experience, if you were to look at the Jira, like the task backlog for Wasteland, you'd note that all of the actual dialogue tasks don't just say write, they say write and test. Now, I don't know quite how often my writers follow those instructions. That's a different question, but the idea is you write something, then you boot up the engine and you play it, which is very good. If you have the tools to do that, it is absolutely needed. Playing a dialogue, especially branching dialogue, and writing it are very far apart as experiences. And I don't care how good you are, how experienced you are at writing, you will always need to actually test and play your dialogues, and not just individual dialogues, but the whole flow of your area. If you don't do that, it's just not going to be the best.
Let's say as a designer lead, you have some sort of a questionable storyline in the game, and one of your team members is absolutely for having that in the game, and you're not very sure, and you go to the players. So how would you judge whether the storyline actually performs well?
That is a tough question, because that's one of those kind of blank box things, I think, in video game. Like, the reality, right, with making video games is that some of it is always going to be a guess until you actually until you can actually have people play it, right? There's been some wild ideas in narrative and in other parts of game design where you go like, I can't believe they tried that, but it worked. But I'm sure that they didn't know that it worked yet either until they actually put it in people's hands. And that's kind of true for video game stories as well. Like, I can put the story laid out on a page in front of people, but I don't think it's very meaningful, because how it's actually experienced and whether it's good, we kind of won't know until people are playing it. Other than, in our case, because we've been doing RPGs for so long, I think the studio's about 20 years old now and has been making RPGs over all that time. We do have a good sense of what works and doesn't work. So generally, I kind of don't have that problem myself. Like, we have a really good team with really good sensibilities, and we tend to all be in agreement on what makes for a strong narrative and what doesn't.
Did you ever encounter the belief that people don't read texts?
Yes, and it's true. People don't like reading text. I think the problem there, though, is it's not so much that people don't read text at all. I think the issue is that
they don't read the boring text.
Exactly. Like, video game writers haven't always respected people's time and pacing. But in my opinion, that's not just text, right? That can be cutscenes as well. Like, you can make a cutscene, even though it's not text and there's a lot going on the screen, it can still last too long, because again, people want to be playing games, not watching, not reading games. Some watching can be okay if the quality is high enough, and some reading can be okay if the quality is high enough. But in my experience, what I like to do is set limits to like how much text there can be before the player has to make an action again. And in our experience, that tends to be the best way to keep the player engaged. So our narratives are always very interactive and very choice-driven things. And that's where we do find, yes, people do read your text. I think part of the problem is when we say people don't read text is because we are just sending out like minutes and minutes of text at the start of the game. Where it's like, yeah, here's my 500-year backstory on my setting, and people just go, I don't care. But what we do is make you make difficult choices and have you live with the consequences of them, right? So when I watch people play Wasteland 3 on Twitch, they read the text very carefully because they're like, oh, this game is going to ask me to make a decision here, and I need to understand the situation. I'm making a decision. And so in other words, make it engaging and make it matter, and then people do read text.
When you're watching the person playing through, let's say, some dialogues on the cutscenes, can you actually rely and say that it's boring if the person is skipping through the text and then iterate on it?
Yes, but only sort of, because a percentage of players will just not read your text, and that has to be okay as well, right? So if we're trying to make all our dialogues based on the notion of, oh, no one is going to skip this over because my dialogue is the best dialogue that was ever dialogued. That's not true, first and foremost, but also it doesn't matter because there is a percentage of players that will always skip through. So I don't consider that a problem when I see it. It hurts my heart a little bit, obviously, but I realize realistically it's how some people are going to play the games. And I have to write the points where they make choices or the points where they go into more linear sequences. Those all have to be delivered in a way that they do still make sense and still work even as you skip through the dialogue. But it's okay is mostly my answer. The beautiful thing about RPGs is that they can be engaged with in very different ways, and they will get some of the narrative and writing experience even just engaging in combat and exploration, because we kind of put it all throughout the game, right? Like you can't really escape it, quote unquote, by skipping dialogues. It's woven throughout the game.
Right. So what are your personal favorite games?
I think I'm old. I'm like 37, I think now. So my personal favorite games are obviously games that I grew up with. So like the original Fallouts, Planescape Torment, a German RPG called Gothic is a personal beloved one. Pathologic by Icepick Lodge out in Russia. Love that game. But also some recent games I absolutely adore, though. Witcher 3, Disco Elysium. Obviously, the list is all RPGs. I'm an RPG person first and foremost. I love RPGs. I love making them. I love playing them. It is what I engage with.
And so as a designer, how do you learn? Do you deconstruct the games you like or the games you don't like?
Yes. I mean, you can never turn it off, right? Like once you've worked in games a certain amount of time, you're going to be like, you're just going to sit down and play and be like taking mental notes. Now, I play games for fun, so I'm not sitting there with a notepad and constantly like breaking it down. We do break games down in like design teams and discussions and things, but just playing, I'll take lessons. I think in general, our industry, we like every game is solving a lot of design problems, right? Over and over. So the more you know how other people have solved those problems, the more you can use that information. Even if you disagree with how they solved the problem, at least you know what solutions were tried before.
Yeah, great. So any personal highlights of things you've worked on?
That is a good question. On Wasteland 3, I did all of the Bazaar, which was a lot of fun and had a lot of wacky characters in there. I think one of my highlights on that, I worked with a fantastic writer on the Bazaar. And we tend to do this thing where we just tell our writers to take things as far as they can, and then we'll figure it out from there. So this writer wrote a character where we said, just make this a foul-mouthed, rude character. And every line of dialogue was this litany of incredibly creative curse words, like the foulest language you've ever seen. And we all thought it was great. And this is one of those video game design processes, right? We thought it was great. We had it all in the dialogue. We took it into the VO booth for the actor to record. And the actor was just like, I can't, I'm trying these lines, but I literally can't say all this stuff. There's just too much here. So we kind of had to rewrite it on the fly in the VO booth. It's still one of the funnest characters in Wasteland 3, and a lot of the creative insults stayed in. But it's funny to me how that process often works, where you have to go from that original idea, which didn't even come from narrative, to a narrative designer executing on it in a very high quality fashion, to then the VO actor engaging with it and being part of the creative process. So narrative is not, I guess that's one thing to comment on there. Narrative is not the only people that own narrative. Like narrative, just like anything else in video games, is iterative and cooperative. Like you have to work with your other departments to get to the best narrative you can.
And you're saying that you ask your writers to actually push as far as they can. But there are a lot of situations where the joke was so good it had to be cut off because it was so offensive.
Yes. Unfortunately I cannot share, I think, the details, but there was an example in Wasteland 3 already goes pretty far. There's a brothel in Wasteland 3 where literally one of the prostitutes is a goat, which was wonderfully written and performed by our VO actor and a lot of fun. There was actually another character in that Dendo that was extremely well written, but then again, the VO actor did such a good job performing it that we were all listening to it and we were just like, this is going too far. Like, this is so good that it actually takes it too far. So we're gonna have to rewrite this and redo it.
Right.
Unfortunately, I cannot be specific on it.
Okay.
It is not safe for work, among other reasons.
We got it. So, any advice for prospective narrative designers?
I think we touched on a lot of it, right? Because again, I think the main advice is realize that you're not just going to be writing. Obviously, at the position I'm in right now, I've done a lot of interview processes and including not just hiring myself, but advising other people on how to interview and what they're looking for. And I'm always happy to talk to prospective narrative designers. But I think the thing that I'll always repeat to them is, don't think you're just writing, and don't show up at an interview with like, oh, I wrote a bunch of short stories and books, I'm ready to write games, because it doesn't really mean anything. Like, be engaged in games, understand what makes games fun, of whatever genre you're interested in and whatever genre the studio is working on. And in particular, if you're going to have samples, and well, you need to have samples. Like, a game writer needs to have a portfolio. It's the same as concept art. If you don't have samples or a portfolio, then no interview is going to go anywhere. But those samples, that portfolio, they kind of have to be interactive. So if you're going to make a sample, don't write a short story, make a little Twine game. Make a little Twine browser game. It'll show any studio you apply to way more about how you write video games than any short story you can write.
And if a person makes it out to the interview with you, what are the indicators you're looking for to distinguish a good writer from a bad writer?
Yeah, that is an interesting question, because that doesn't super happen at the interview. That actually does happen at the samples. I will read a person's samples and try to get a sense of like how they write. And I think the main thing that I think I and a lot of my fellow lead and director like people would look for is, can you write different voices and can you write natural voices? So I hope that makes sense. Like, does every character in your short story or interactive Twine, do they all sound like the same person? Because that is bad, because that, like, obviously video games always have a ton of characters, other than, obviously there are some games that are like, here's only one main character, and obviously there's some games with no writing, but let's leave those aside. On games like ours, there's hundreds and hundreds of characters, and they all need to have a unique voice, and they all need to sound natural. So usually, especially nowadays when VO is heavier, you need to be able to write people that sound differently, like that they have different backgrounds and personalities, but also deliver lines that can just go straight to VO, for which my advice is always read what you wrote out loud. Like, all of us narrative people, all of us writers always seem like crazy people in the studio, because we're just sitting at our computer and we're like growling out dialogue at our screen all the time, because we have to say the stuff that we write. Because again, it doesn't matter how good you are or how long you've been doing this. If you don't say your dialogues, you're never going to notice the spots where it's like, oh, that doesn't sound natural, or that's going to make a VO actor trip up because my sentence is going on too long, or the words are just a little bit weird.
Is there something that sets you like triggered in particular when you see someone's samples, like answering to a question with a question, or like having too much words without a lot of sense? Is something like which is a huge red flag, like from the very beginning?
I don't think there's something super specific. Personally, I actually don't really care about, but opinions on this can differ, so don't take this as universal advice. Personally, I don't care how polished writing is, because writing can always get polished over time. So I don't even care if a sample has, well, I do care if a sample has grammar mistakes, because you should really polish up your samples as if they're chip games. I think the red flag for me is a little more ephemeral. It's, do you have like, is there character here? Like, is there humor? Is there, like I said, right? Because we're so driven by, our story should be driven by characters and their interactions, jokes, dramas, emotions. If I read your whole short story or Twine, did you ever evoke an emotional reaction from me? Is there a moment where you surprised me? Is there a moment where you engaged in my feelings? If you understand that narrative arc, if you understand, like, I think the writing term is microtensions, where you're constantly keeping the reader on his or her toes and making sure that they're engaged with your writing. If your samples show that, then you're gold with me. But you'd be surprised by how many samples just don't have that, are just kind of like flat throughout. And they can be very well written from a pure words perspective, but they're not engaging, and that makes it not a no-go for me.
Great. All right. So finally, we can have some time to answer the questions from the chat. And so let's start. The first one is a person is comparing the Wasteland 3 beginning, which was very intense, to Wasteland 2 beginning, which is supposed to be like much slower. Yep. And the question is, how did you come up with the decision to drastically change the approach to game start and make a tutorial so dynamic and engaging in Wasteland 3?
Right, that is a good question, and the answer is just we just kind of learned that the Wasteland 2 start just doesn't work in the way that people engage in games now. I don't know if that immediately makes sense, but games are starting to be a bit more like Netflix, right? Like pick and choose. You can have live services, you can have streaming services, you can try out games on Steam and refund them, right? So asking the patience of players to engage in your game for like 10 hours and then be like, no, after 10 hours it gets good. That's not a thing. Like you have to grab your players in the first 30 minutes. And if you don't, you've lost already, right? So that's just a lesson Wasteland 2 is a very long and how do I put it? Like very calmly paced game, because it takes so long to get everywhere. And I think there's nothing wrong with that, and it engages with the players that it engages with, but you do lose a lot of players along the way. So Wasteland 3, and honestly all our games, we just know our focus is always going to be that first, whatever it is, half hour, 1 hour. It has to knock it out of the park, both in the sense of like the player has to understand everything, like the stakes and the setting, and it has to be immediately engaging, because if you lose people, then you've already lost them at that point.
I absolutely agree. Okay, so next question. We've touched upon that a bit, but if you could name like 3 your absolutely favorite games.
The absolute favorites, I think those would still be the first Fallout, Planescape Torment, and the first Gothic game, so fairly old, but it's possible The Witcher 3 snuck in there now too. So let's say Fallout 1, Planescape Torment, and The Witcher 3.
Great. Can you give a pro level tip for playtesting or UX testing of narrative in games? Something that we may have not touched before.
No, we didn't really touch on that. That is a interesting question. A little bit tricky for me to answer in the sense of personally, I didn't do QA or playtesting, so other than as a developer, so I have to preface that to say I'm not professional QA, and a professional QA person can probably give you better advice, because it is a specialized field of playtesting, and one that on our studio definitely we fully respect. I think the most important thing, at least from the developer's perspective, is when you are, I think that the best pro level tip is simply good documentation and good steps. So as you're testing things, right, they have to be outlined very clearly. What are you testing? What do you expect, or how do you expect things to work, and how do they actually work? And then you can run it through a number of tests with a number of QA testers and see your rate of return. This is true for both simple bug testing, so simple like do things work testing, but it is also true for what we would kind of call iterative testing, where you're just play testing and trying to make it better. The clearer your outline is of like what are we actually trying to do versus like how close are we to doing it, needs to be very clearly defined. The instruction of like, okay, here's a level, just go play, that's not going to get you anywhere because it's not clear enough what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I mean, before you start play testing, you usually need to understand what is the theory you're actually testing, because
Yes.
it could be like, okay, we want to understand what is the general reaction to this level or this part of the narrative, but actually it's more like, okay, we need to understand like how good it is or how bad it is, and for that we need to have some sort of a I wouldn't say KPIs, probably landmarks. So some sort of indicators that would like tell you, okay, like from this to this it's good, from this to that it's bad.
Yeah,
and
it can,
like there's in the middle, of course.
Yes, and it can be very highly specific, to be clear. Like it can simply be when we've done this, let's say there's a shorter level where you're expecting a certain dramatic arc and there's a certain amount of information you need the player to come out of. If you want to test that, then simply write down that dramatic, like what feeling am I expecting? What information am I expecting them to have? Have a bunch of testers do it and ask them, don't give them your information, obviously, but simply ask them those two questions. Like, what are your prevailing like emotions at the end of this level? And what did you learn about the story? And if that doesn't match what you're expecting, then you know kind of where to aim your iteration.
All right, thanks. So the next question, we've touched upon a couple of tools you guys are using, and it's obviously an internal technology. But do you keep your script or a script breakdown in some sort of a document, or is it just divided across the internal tool?
The actual script, in the sense of our in-game text and our VO text, does not exist in Final Draft in our process. I do not like myself to use something like Final Draft. However, that is because I work purely in branching dialogues. To me, that those two things don't translate. So if you work in branching dialogues and very complicated dialogues, you kind of have to work in tools. If you work on straighter scripts, just like cutscene scripts, yeah, you can use Final Draft, of course. Early on, we do kind of paper documentation in whatever format we have. That can be anything from Final Draft to simple like Word documents. Obviously, we do those in pre-production, and like I said, updating that documentation, but that's more like design documentation to me. The actual script purely exists in the tools.
Is there some sort of a high-level script vision or a narrative vision that exists as a doc, like one pager?
A lot, actually, because you kind of have to, right? So in my experience, the best video game projects always start with vision docs, key pillars identified, all those things, because that's how you make sure that everyone has the same vision. And then every department usually has a cascading level of more and more detailed documentation of what people can know. So what are our narrative keywords? What are our narrative keywords per zone or per quest? What is our main story arc? And then I, as the lead, obviously I write a lot of documentation that I need my writers to engage in, which can be anything from like style guides and writing rules to here are our overall design tenets, our philosophies, things that I expect to show up in every quest, or things that I expect to show up in every dialogue.
Right. Okay, guys, so I think we are running out of time, so we need to say our goodbyes. Thomas, it was great to have you. I think it was a very interesting conversation. We covered a lot of stuff, like from being an experienced veteran to being like only a newbie who's starting its way. And guys, be sure to have an interview with Thomas whenever you can. So thanks a lot. Hopefully, we'll meet each other soon on one of the next DevGAMMs, probably live. Hopefully, we are.